Hi there, I'm Andrew Brown. Welcome to Real-Time Music and Sound with Pure Data. In this episode, we're going to be looking at performance-ready patches. What I've found over time is that while PD is super good for really fast prototyping of things, we often want to also use it for performances where patches need to be a little bit more robust. So this is a bit of a list that I've prepared of things which seem, in my experience, to be useful things to do to make sure your patches are ready to be robust when it comes to live performance, which is a bit of a stressful situation and you don't want things to go wrong. So it's a long list, I understand. I'll try and get through it as quickly as we can be and make this as efficient as possible. So I'm going to assume that we're sort of on stage with our laptop and performing live. The first thing is I always recommend, if you haven't already planned to make sure you've got a MIDI controller to control things rather than a mouse. So let's have a look first at a patch and see how we go from there. So in order to get us going, I've prepared a patch, and this is it here. It's a relatively straightforward ring modulation of 2 square waves, well actually pulse width waves. Sounds a little bit like this. Just kind of, nice and noisy. It's got a couple of control oscillators. These are square waves with a bit of an amplitude envelope as well. I'm going through a volume and some reverb just for the hell of it. So this is the patch. This is my little PD instrument which I want to perform with. So first thing I recommend is to make sure we've got MIDI control over those things. So I've got a MIDI controller attached, so I can use Control in, and I happen to know that I've got one controller on 8. If I just it's going, and I can do the same for the other one. And I think this one is 12. Okay, so it's a bit better. So now okay, so that's much easier to do that with 2 hands on 2 MIDI controllers rather than trying to perform with my mouse. Okay, so I really should have MIDI control over volume as well. You notice that the previous ones already we're using M2F MIDI to frequency to get to the frequency. Here we've got volume, which goes between 0 and 1 typically. So I'm going to have to put in a control in, and then make sure that I divide that by 127 so that I get to the appropriate range. Like so. And now, excellent, I've got control now over my volume as I want it. Okay, so that's my instrument. We want to make sure all these things work in combination, and they do, and there's no problems with that. If you have more than one MIDI controller, whilst we're talking about MIDI controllers, if we have a look at the MIDI settings in PD, you'll see that it does allow you to use multiple devices, and you can add them as many as you really need to. Just remembering that if it's an input device that comes in as number 2, the MIDI channels will start at 17. So the first ones will go from 1 to 16, and the next ones will be from 0 to 17. At the moment I'm not specifying a MIDI channel, so that doesn't matter. So if I just make sure there's no conflicts between the controller numbers or the MIDI numbers, that should be fine. So obviously this is a very big patch. I don't really need to see all of this stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually copy all that out and stick it all in a subpatch. So let's call my subpatch instrument, paste everything in there. Okay, so here it is, so that's all good. So we have our instrument subpatch, which is represented here by this. So in order to make sure that we can control a few things, everything's now hidden. That's probably not any better than having everything exposed. So typically what I would do, I know I've got 3 controls. There's the 2 oscillator frequencies and my volume. So I put sliders and so forth on the outside to make sure that I can control those things. Actually, let's use vertical sliders. Okay, so I have 1 vertical slider. Now in order to communicate, I could put inlets and so forth in, which would be fine, but I prefer to keep a nice clean interface for this, so I'm going to send and receive messages to do that. So have a look at the properties for this. 0 to 127 is fine. I'll give it a label, call it oscillator 1, and I'll send symbol oscillator 1. What do I call this? Yeah, pitch is fine. Oscillator 1 pitch. Give it a bit of a color, and that's fine. So over here in my subpatch, I can receive oscillator 1 pitch, so that if I do use that fader, all right, so we'll just check that that's working. There we go, that's all good. So I can do a similar thing for the second oscillator, change its properties, call it oscillator 2, and change its name to oscillator 2 pitch. So that's all good. One thing which I'll do before I move on is I probably want to be able to see the MIDI control changes here too, so I'm going to get it to receive. I'm going to call it oscillator 2 MIDI as a receive message. So when we go here, we'll do a similar thing. We're going to receive the oscillator 2 pitch. That's going to go in here. But we will also make sure that we send oscillator to MIDI data out when we receive it in. And we'll do the same over here. Send oscillator to MIDI data from there. So that means now when I move, oops, it's oscillator 1 MIDI, my mistake. And that needs to be put into here as a receive message, oscillator 1 MIDI. Okay, that's that one, and that's that one, and I can control them if I need to, if I don't have my MIDI controller attached. Okay, so that's all good. And we'll copy and paste that again, and change this to be our volume. I might give it a different color just to discriminate, and obviously the messages are going to be volume send. Let's call this volume receive. So over here, create those messages, receive, volume send. It's going to go there. And we also want to send volume receive, which I know sounds a bit weird, but nevertheless, that's what we're doing. Okay, so now volume on my MIDI controller works, and volume there. Turn it down. Yep, that's also working. Okay, so that just gives me a nice clean GUI that I can have, and I can make sure that my subpatches are closed. Which brings me to the next point. When you save your PD patches, if your subpatches are open at that time, then when you reopen the patch, the subpatches will be open at the time of things. So for performance, you don't really want to see the subpatches necessarily, so just make sure they're all closed before you save the patch. Now the next thing is that that's sort of working from a control perspective, but I actually can't necessarily see whether or not I've got any audio coming out. So particularly when you're doing sound checks and so forth, if the front of house is not turned on, you want to make sure you've got audio locally, even if you can't hear it. So in order to do that, we're going to put a VU meter here and make sure that our audio is sending to this. So we will, in anticipation for that, we can see that we've got a receive symbol for this too, and let's call it audio level. It's all good. So now inside our subpatch, we need to send that out. So these need an envelope follower, and I know from experience that we need to subtract some values from that envelope follower, and then we'll need to send to the audio level. I think that's what I called it. Let's just double check that. Audio level, yep. Okay, so output there can go into here. Perfect. So even if we couldn't hear that, we can visually see that we've got audio data going. So all these things are kind of useful. Make it look a little bit nicer, a little more compact. And so there we have that. So the other thing I guess we need is if for some reason these sliders weren't going, it'd be nice to know whether or not we've got our MIDI stuff connected and working. So I'm going to put a little sort of indicator for our MIDI thing here. All we really need to do for this is just to use a bang. We can give it a label, MIDI symbol. It's going to receive MIDI data. And give it a color. Okay, so now we need to have a thing which is going to send a MIDI data thing. Basically, anytime we get any of these MIDI controllers data, we want to send that. And it's not important what values they are because it's just going to a bang. It says here. MIDI data. MIDI data, Andrew. Thank you. Okay, and so that's flashing now whenever we get MIDI signals, just to confirm visually that that's all happening. We've got a master slider for our volume, which is always really important. One thing which can happen if you're using MIDI controllers, and particularly if you've got keyboards, I haven't got any notes coming in for here, is to make sure that you may have like a MIDI Panic kind of button just to send an all notes off signal. This is not quite as straightforward as it seems, but I have prepared a patch which I'll show you now for sending an all notes off. So you can see, well, it's easier for me to use this pre-prepared one because it would take me a little while to rebuild this. Let's have a look and see how it's working. If we start from the bottom, obviously it's sending MIDI out messages. We're going to be sending note off messages, so that if we've got a keyboard attached and we've got a stuck note for any reason, then it'll send a note off to every single key. MIDI out sends raw MIDI messages. So we're packing in this data. So 128 as the default thing is the note off message in MIDI for MIDI channel 1. 60 is middle C, 0 is the velocity. So this is the three elements of the message we're going to send. We need to send it to different notes every time, and I've also put in here we can offset the channel if we want to send it to a different channel. At the moment it's going to send to channel 1. And then up here we've got a counter which is getting 127. The until will just repeat that over and over again 127 times. So this counter will go from 0 to 127 across the entire MIDI pitch range and send a note off signal to every single note. And the way that that's evaluated is to basically click on that there. So again, what we can do is actually use this as a subpatch. I'm going to copy that all out. Create an additional subpatch called Panic. Actually, maybe MIDI Panic might be more explicit. And I'll paste it in here. Okay, so there it is. And again, we need to do what we need to do to get in and out of here. And again, keeping things nice and clean, we'll use a receive panic message, and that will bang there. And out here, we might put bang, and we'll call it panic, and we send the symbol panic, and we'll get a nice panicky color like so. So if we open up this subpatch again, and it's going to be a bit tricky, put that over there maybe so you can see it, and then press panic, and if you saw, it was a bit of a flash, but it went from 0 to 126, actually, from 0 to 126. So basically send a nodes off message everywhere whenever we click that. We've got this MIDI Panic patch down here. All right, so we close that up. So now we've got a sort of much more robust thing. Another thing that I like to add too is some kind of timer for clocking. So when you're on stage and you're performing, one of the things I find is that you need to work out how long it is you've been playing, and time can mess with your head a little bit. It's hard to judge time when you're on stage in a sort of stressful situation, I've found. So it's good to have a clock. So I prepared a clock, which I'll show you here, which we can put into this patch. Whenever you bang this reset button, it just starts counting, and it shows you how many minutes and seconds you've been going. So you just click this at the beginning of your performance, and there you go. In order to see this, got a subpatch here. The way this PD clock is working, it's just a metronome set to 1,000, so it's just counting seconds, and it's doing modulo in order to go around 60 for the seconds, and every time it does that around 60, then we know we've been going for 1 minute. 1 minute increments up, and then the counter keeps going in seconds infinitely. When we reset, we just set the counter back to 0. Okay, so I can again copy and paste all of this, add a new subpatch in here, PD clock, and that's good and well. We've got this minutes and seconds thing and the reset. We probably want to cut that out of the subpatch and make sure it's available here. I can probably reset it a little over the top, possibly in terms of its size. So we might just make that a little smaller, and we can adjust the position of thing, but we're basically there. We reset that, and it goes back to 0. So now we've got a little clock to go. All right, so I think my interface is pretty good right now. So what are some other things which can potentially go wrong and may need to be looked after? So in my experience, making sure that your audio MIDI preferences are done. So when you start PD on your laptop, everything works. And as you can see, we've got things like audio settings and so forth. One thing just to note is that if you click the Save All Settings, then those settings will reappear when you reopen PD. So if you haven't been doing that, just make sure you do that, and then that will save you some grief. And the same with the MIDI as well. Another thing which can happen is that you may forget to turn on the DSP, and so therefore you get no sound, and it's a bit frustrating. You're going, why aren't I getting any sound? And it's as simple as having to do that. So we can make sure that that happens automatically by sending a message to PD to basically turn the DSP on. And we want to make sure that this starts whenever the patch is done. So we can do that, and then that will send the DSP on message to PD. To be very clean, I can probably put that inside my instrument subpatch like so, and so we don't need to see that. So that's all good. Whilst we're on the question of the load bang, we might also want to make sure that we send particular values to things like the volume or the oscillators so that they've got a starting point. Particularly volume, it seems useful in my experience to always start with a sort of modest volume. So you might just send a value like 0.1, like 10% volume, and again just use a load bang to set that as a starting point. And that just sort of indicates that we're basically going to start with a small amount of volume, so it's not going to blow our heads off, but it's not nothing, so we know that things are going to work and we're not sort of scrambling around wondering what's going on. If we're doing that, it means that our volume slider may not be on the right thing, so we might make sure that we also send a number to it. So 10%, you know, roughly 127, what is it, 13 or something like that, and then send that out to there on load bang, and that will just automatically put our volume slider at a certain amount. And we probably do similar things maybe for pitch, if we wanted to start in a particular location for our pitch. Okay, the other thing you can do with these volume sliders is to have an initial value. At the moment it says there's no initial value. If you turn this on so that there is an initial value, then whatever value is the slider is at when the patch is saved will be the initial one. So that can be useful as well. I sometimes find it's not quite as useful as using the load bang technique, because that's much more straightforward. Sometimes I've set my init on, but I've just kind of forget where this slider is when I save, and I resave the patch and it's in a different location. But anyway, you can do that if you prefer. What else? If you're working, we're not in this patch working with any arrays, but if you are working with an array in your thing, for example a wave folder or something like that, or even a sample, I guess, you may want to make sure that this contents are saved. This is the default position, but it's possible that it could be turned off if you don't need it. If it's using up a lot of memory, then you don't need to do that. But if it's a wavetable or something that you want to make sure is there whenever you start up, then save contents will make sure that that array is saved as well. So I think that's most of the things. I'm now sort of ready to do some crazy noise performance. Because the next thing is just to make sure that your patches are saved in a few locations and you've got backups and you don't lose your instrument. I often like to put a copy of my patch on a cloud service so that if I happen to turn up to my gig and something's gone wrong and I haven't got my drive or something, and then I can always download the patch. If you want to be super careful about things, you might also want to put your patch on a second device. One of the things that I often do is I'm carrying my phone with me, and I use MobiPlat, mobile music platform, put my patch on there so that in the worst case scenario my computer dies or something, I can grab my phone and I can use my phone to perform as a secondary device. That can be great. The other thing which can go wrong in terms of saving is if you're using abstractions. You'll notice that throughout this video I copied and pasted all these things like the clock and the MIDI Panic and stuff in. They could have been abstractions which I just imported. The reason that I tend not to do that for live performance is just that oftentimes the patches get disassociated. So you take your main patch but you forget to take the abstractions with you, and that can be really super frustrating. But if your patch has got abstractions, just make sure they're all kind of zipped up together or something like that when you're moving your files around so you don't forget them. Anyway, that's enough for me. Hopefully this is helping you get some more kind of interesting patches that are performative as you want to go, and enjoy your live performance with PD. See you in another video.